All right, so today is the second part of our series, A Bigger Table. The series is looking at Luke 14 and 15, and it's all based around a meal that Jesus had at the house of a Pharisee. And we're going to read, so hopefully this will work. Does that come up? There we are, look at this. So we're going to read Luke 14, verses 1 to 6. And it says this: One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of his body. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. Then he asked them, "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" And they had nothing to say. It says in those words I just read that Jesus was being carefully watched. And we know that from earlier in Luke's Gospel, since chapter 11, verse 54, which was the last meal that Jesus had had with a Pharisee, they were looking for an opportunity. They were looking for a chance to catch him out. And so here we have Jesus going to eat with another Pharisee. And the context of that reminds me, sorry, it's a Star Wars reference, but it reminds me of a conversation in Star Wars. And Obi-Wan is saying that he senses that there is a trap that lies ahead. And he's asked, "So what then is our next step?" And he says, "Spring the trap. Spring the trap." Knowing that they're out to get him, Jesus walks right into it. He walks in to find the setup. There's a man who's described as having an abnormal swelling of his body. And you can imagine the glee that the Pharisees must have felt that Jesus was walking right into this, right into the trap. We're told that it was the Sabbath. It was the day of rest that was commanded in the Old Testament law that was given to Moses. What was meant as a gift to the world, time off from working, for rest, for recreation, for worship, had become something oppressive, something that was burdensome in the hands of the religious folk. When we started this series a few weeks ago, I tried to give some insight into the mindset of the Pharisees. You might remember that sort of meditation, that imagination exercise of cleaning the window, and how they got so focused on the window that they stopped looking through what was the other side, the beautiful view, and just focused on the window itself. That was what their mindset was like. But before we think that, well, this is just a problem of those Pharisees in first century Israel, there's a long history of restrictions being placed on the Sabbath by religious people. And some of it is much more recent. In Puritan times, preserving the Sabbath included things such as children were not allowed to play. There was no sports. Walking in the countryside was permitted, but only if you were on your way to a church service. There was to be no kissing. Not even holding hands. Oh no. And definitely, because I can hear some of you, no laughing. Laughing was out. More recently, in Victorian times, there were also those who believed that children should not play on the Sabbath. There was ideas that taking public transport was absolutely not appropriate, and even museums were banned from opening. And these sort of attitudes, we can think, oh yeah, but that's still quite a long time ago, but they persist. And I've got this picture. This was taken a few years ago on one of the Scottish islands. I found an article in the Scottish Daily Mail from 2018. So that's not that long ago, is it? And it quoted a man who was saying that measures such as padlocking swings on the Sabbath on a Sunday was actually showing real love to children because it was preventing them from distractions from the love of our Lord Jesus. The irony is, of course, They all end up trying to point people to Jesus in a way that is much more like the Pharisees were. It's much more their way of doing things. And there is a culture clash between the way of Jesus and the way of the Pharisees. See, theirs is about purity through rules, through regulations. Jesus' way is about grace. But whenever I think about that, whenever I think about the theme of grace, I'm haunted by words that I read probably about 25 years ago now, but they still stick with me in Philip Yancey's book, What's So Amazing About Grace. And he writes of a woman whose life is in an awful, awful mess, like horrible stuff going on in her life. And she ends up talking to a pastor who says, have you ever considered going to church? And this was her response. I was already feeling bad enough about myself. Why would I want to go there? They would simply make me feel worse. You know, that woman needed Jesus and she needed his grace. But what she expected from church was it would just grind her down even more. And that's what religion does. Religion had nothing to offer her. And to go back to our passage in Luke, religion had nothing to offer the man who was suffering. Just as these religious folk were thinking in the story that they'd got him, Jesus turns the tables on them in a brilliant way. He asks them whether it's lawful to heal a man on the Sabbath or not. Now, these were the experts. These were the people who knew the law inside and out. If you wanted to know an answer, surely they were the people to ask. So he asks them. And it says they have nothing to say. They were quite happy to criticize Jesus. They were quite happy to set him up for criticism. But they were not so eager to take the responsibility for denying healing and restoration to someone in need because it was the Sabbath. Jesus' question exposed the religious culture. It exposed what was going on in their hearts. See, the religious spirit had nothing to offer in terms of healing. It had nothing to say, and it had no compassion. For the religious people, making their point was more important than the man before them and the state that he was in. He was unacceptable. He was unclean. He was unworthy. And he wasn't there just as one of the guests. He was brought there as bait for a trap for Jesus. Jesus touches the untouchable. And it says he takes hold of the man. And that's not the minimal touch. You know, when kids get the opportunity to meet some exotic creatures, and there's always, you know, spiders and snakes and stuff like that, and there's those who are enthusiastic, and there's those who it's like, and the slightest, smallest touch, or not at all. That's not what Jesus was like. He took hold of the man. And that word that's translated, take hold, is quite an interesting one. It literally means to take hold of, but it can also mean to catch. It includes showing concern. It includes offering help, assistance, support, and rescue. And in fact, it can also mean to take hold of, to make it something one's own. Jesus was taking this man to himself, to hold him, to make him his own. The man who was brought there was an example of the unacceptable, to be bait for the trap. There was no thought of his worth or his dignity because, according to the rules, he had none. Jesus touches him, takes him to himself, accepts him, is concerned for him, and helps him. What religion couldn't do, Jesus does. The man is healed. He is sent on his way. Healing, restoration, dignity restored from the illness and from the whole thing of being made a spectacle of. And another thing to note is that an illness like what that man was suffering, so it's thought to be dropsy, edema, it would have been seen as a result of sin. Jesus doesn't say, go and sin no more. It's not there in the passage. He doesn't tell the man, go and sin no more. And that can be our go-to when we're confronted with people whose behaviour, the way that they live life is not what we're comfortable with. Now, Jesus did say those words other times. He did tell people to go and sin no more. But more often than not, he seems to accept people without using those words. And knowing how sinful I am, I would want to be very careful in saying those words myself to somebody, go and sin no more. It's one thing for Jesus to say it. He lived a perfect life. He was without sin. He died on the cross in our place to pay the penalty for sin and to free us from it. It's one thing for him to say, go and sin no more. It's quite another for me or for you to say it. Some things, I think, are better left to Jesus. And that doesn't mean we have to make out that things are okay when they're not. It doesn't mean condoning sin. But does it mean perhaps that we could foster an environment where we can be honest, where we can be open about our mistakes and our failings without having to cover them up because of fear from the Christian morality police, from fear of being excluded from the church because we don't behave in the right way? And I think a real question that we need to grapple with in this series is this: is Jesus big enough and powerful enough to deal with sin? What do you reckon? Is he? I think that's a good answer. I think he is. And if he is, then we must make sure that our righteousness doesn't get in the way of others being made righteous by him. Jesus, in our passage, asks another question, and I think by now they must be really squirming. If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out? And it says, and they had nothing to say. See, the answer is obvious, but they couldn't bring themselves to admit it. To do so would have been an admission that their animals were of greater worth to them than the man that Jesus had just healed. And the thing with grace and mercy is that if you haven't experienced grace and mercy yourself, then you can't show it to other people. See, religion replaces grace with rule keeping. And the rules we keep reveal a great deal about what we value the most. The Pharisees were obsessed by what was permitted on the Sabbath. Jesus was more interested in what the Sabbath was intended for. For Jesus, healing and everything that went with it was exactly what the Sabbath was for. The writer Darrell Bock writes about this passage, says this: the Sabbath became a day of exclusion for them, so that compassion was limited in how it could be expressed. See, once acts of compassion are excluded, those who need that compassion are easily excluded too. As Jesus broadened the scope of what should be included on the Sabbath, he also broadened the scope of who could be included. A couple of chapters earlier, Jesus had warned about what he said was the yeast of the Pharisees. And there's a reason that he gave that warning, because yeast spreads through the dough and permeates the whole loaf and affects the whole thing. And that's what it's like with rule keeping and that sort of legalistic way of doing things. It spreads through, it does infect it all. When we keep rules and when we focus on that, it can become a way for us to look down on those who don't keep the rules or those who can't keep the rules. Another thing I read was this: we're in trouble if we keep the rules to justify ourselves and to feel more righteous than others. In the Christian life, we are not striving for success in keeping the rules. We are to love our neighbours and put their interests first. Some of you know that I've always, for many years, appreciated John Eldridge's writings. And I was looking at his book, Beautiful Outlaw, and it's all about Jesus. And there's a chapter in there which has got this title, Clearing Away the Religious Fog. And in it he talks about how this stuff is what infuriates Jesus. Where is it? There it is. What infuriates Jesus, so it ought to be what infuriates us. And he goes on to ask, what was the last piece of religious nonsense that you were angry with? What was the last piece of religious nonsense that you were angry with. And he writes, if we think that this was just a problem back in the Bible times for the Pharisees, then we've already been deceived. The religious fog uses sanctified words and activities, things that look and sound very Sunday school, to distort our perceptions of God and our experience of him. It is cunning as a snake and as adaptive as the flu, infiltrating our practices to make them ever so false. And he goes on, and he gives a whole list of headings. I'm not going to go into all the detail of them. If you want to find out more, you can get the book and have a look at it. But there's 2 slides of headings of things that reveal something of this religious fog. Oh, this isn't working. Can you forward it? Thank you, Jeremy. So, false reverence replaces loving Jesus. So it's more about being a good Christian than it is about loving Jesus. Knowing about God substitutes for knowing God. Power displays are confused for intimacy with Jesus. So chasing miracles rather than chasing the miracle giver. Religious activity is confused with commitment to Christ. Christian service substitutes for friendship with Jesus. The holiness of God is taught by making him unknowable or unapproachable. Next one, please. Oh, it's on there. Thank you. Holiness is substituted with rule keeping. A trivial morality prevails. So smoking and swearing are things that are seen as ever so terrible, but a blind eye can be turned to someone who's domineering and bullying because they're a great person who gets things done in the life of the church. The system operates on the fear of man. Yeah, don't cross me because you'll get in trouble. False humility is honoured. And there is safety in distance, which is all about holding Jesus at arm's length and holding one another at arm's length too. Some interesting things there. You can get hold of the book for more, but all this fog is whirling around in our passage today, and Jesus comes to cut through it. A few more words from Darrell Bock. Thank you. The Pharisees were not ready for any surprises. They wanted to define the limits of God's work. We sometimes risk missing what God is doing because we think we know how he will act. Those who wish to see God at work must be careful not to dictate to him. He acts as he wills, and he has revealed aspects of his will to us. But that does not mean that he cannot sovereignly choose to manifest his grace in new ways not yet revealed to us. God will accomplish his plan, but we can be sure that it may come in surprising ways. This series, A Bigger Table, is about the need for our table to be big enough that we don't restrict God and we don't restrict what he wants to do. Just because it doesn't fit necessarily with what we think God should be doing, it doesn't mean that God is not at work, that he is not doing it. And we just need to be really careful that we don't end up being a blockage to what he wants to do. We're going to pray. And what I want to do is I want to use a prayer that was in John Eldridge's book that he provides as a way of just saying, Jesus, reveal yourself afresh to us. Cut through this fog. And so I want to pray the prayer, and then I just want to leave some space and some time for us just to be quiet, just to reflect, to listen to what God might want to say to us, what he might want to do in us today. Let's pray. Jesus, show me who you really are. I pray for the true you. I want the real you. I ask for you. Spirit of God, free me in every way to know Jesus as he really is. Open my eyes to see him. Deliver me from everything false about Jesus and bring me what is true. Deliver me from the spirit of falsehood and everything religious. And let's just wait on him and see what he has to say.